woman doesn't need permission to be extraordinary, only opportunity. She wasn't supposed to touch the engine, let alone fix it. So how did a teenage girl walk into a garage full of experts and leave them speechless? Let us know in the comments section below. Who the hell brings their kid to a workplace like this? Vince Harlow muttered, squinting through his coffee steam at the garage entrance. He hadn't even looked up when the bell over the shop door clanged. He didn't need to. That tone of voice, the polite one, too polite, was always how Malcolm Greer talked when he was trying to soften a blow. "Morning, Vince," Malcolm said, and right behind him walked a tall, lanky girl with box braids and an oversized black hoodie. She carried herself like she wasn't sure whether to hide behind her father or push past him. Vince's eyes narrowed. "This your apprentice now?" he asked, half a smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth. Malcolm patted his daughter's shoulder. "This is Melissa. She's just observing today." Vince's smirk didn't move. "Sure, observing." He took a long sip of his black coffee. "Hope she brought earplugs. Things get loud when real work starts." Melissa looked up then, met his eyes, just for a second, not long enough to speak, but long enough to make Vince uncomfortable. The shop behind him rattled with the clank of wrenches and the low hum of impact drills. Curtis "Tank" Delaney, the crew chief, was under a '91 Camaro with his boots sticking out. Jaden, the baby-faced apprentice with motor oil smeared on his forehead like war paint, was elbow-deep in a busted Honda Civic. Malcolm cleared his throat. "You said the Ferrari came in?" "B3, Vince said, waving a hand like he couldn't be bothered. "Don't let her get in the way." They didn't talk about what Malcolm had been before the accident. Everyone in that garage knew. He was the legend who could tune an engine with his eyes closed, until one bad fall from a lift took his knees and almost took his hands. What nobody knew, not really, was that while Malcolm had been learning how to walk again, Melissa had been stealing hours in their shed, building engines from junkyard scraps, and sketching torque ratios like bedtime stories. They walked past Tank and Jaden without a word. Jaden shot Melissa a curious glance. She didn't return it. Her eyes were fixed on the gleaming red Ferrari sitting like a lion in a cage. Bay 3. It was a 2015 Ferrari 458 Speciale, mid-engine, 4.5-liter V8, 597 horsepower, growled like a monster when it was angry. Except now, it wasn't growling at all. It was dead silent, which made it scarier. "Wouldn't even turn over?" Malcolm asked, bending low and brushing a finger along the edge of the chassis like it was glass. "Nah. Owner said it started misfiring on I-95, then just quit. Couple other places couldn't figure it out." Melissa stepped closer without asking. She moved slow, deliberate, her fingers twitching at her sides. Her father didn't stop her. Tank shouted from across the garage, voice booming over the music. "She gonna sniff it back to life?" Vince laughed, too loud and too long. "Yeah. Maybe it just needs a nice long talk about its feelings." Jaden laughed along, but then saw Melissa's expression and stopped. She leaned over the engine bay, eyes scanning every inch. She didn't touch anything. Not yet. But Malcolm was watching. He knew that look. The same way his eyes used to map out combustion chambers and belt systems. "Melissa," he said gently, "what do you think?" She stepped back. "Can I hear it try to crank?" Vince chuckled. "She want us to jump it too? Maybe grab her a juice box while we're at it?" But Tank was already turning the key. The Ferrari coughed like a smoker and sputtered into silence. Melissa's eyes narrowed. Again. Tank raised a brow, looked at Malcolm, then did it again. The same result. She turned and looked at Vince. "You guys checked the crank sensor?" Vince blinked. She continued. "Misfiring at highway speed, sudden stall, no restart. Sensor might be sending erratic data to the E." Jaden muttered, "She's right." Vince looked like he'd been slapped. "We already checked the OBD readouts. No codes." "If it's shorting intermittently," Melissa said calmly, "it wouldn't throw a code. Not until it fails entirely." No one spoke. Then Jayden pulled out his tablet, tapped it open, and muttered, "Dude. Crank's sensor circuit shows flickers and voltage spikes. She's damn." Tank slid out from under the Camaro, grease streaking his arms, and wandered over, arms crossed. Melissa turned to Malcolm. "If we bypass the sensor temporarily and just run a manual voltage test, we'll see it drop when it tries to crank." "Go ahead," Malcolm said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Vince didn't speak, didn't blink. He just watched. She moved with speed now, grabbing a voltmeter, clipping leads with practiced hands, isolating wires like she'd done it 100 times. Because she had, just not here. Tank hovered behind her, arms still crossed, brow furrowed. The voltmeter needle danced. On the third crank, it flatlined. "There," she said simply. Malcolm looked at Vince. "Told you she wasn't just observing." For the first time all morning, Vince said nothing. But Melissa wasn't done. She reached for a replacement sensor from the parts shelf, fitted it clean, and nodded to Tank. He turned the key. The Ferrari snarled to life. The growl echoed through the garage like thunder. Jayden's jaw hung open. Tank let out a low whistle. And Vince? He just stared. Out of the car. It hurt. Melissa Bosley didn't smile. She didn't need to. The sound of that engine did it for her. And that was only her first 5 minutes. The car was still rumbling when Melissa stepped back, wiping her hands on the rag she'd yanked from her hoodie pocket. Everyone in the garage heard the engine purring. No one spoke. Then, without missing a beat, Vince reached for his coffee. Sipped it like none of this had happened. "You got lucky," he said. Melissa blinked, slow. Not offended. Not surprised either, just confirmed. Malcolm opened his mouth, probably to defend her, but Melissa cut him off with a quiet, "It's fine." Vince wasn't finished. "You knew what to check, 'cause you read it somewhere. Book smart, not shop smart." That time, she didn't answer, just nodded slightly, like she knew how this game was played. You win, and they move the goalposts. No big deal. Jayden broke the silence. That wasn't luck. Vince ignored him. "Tank, get her something small. Tire rotation or brake pad swap. Let's see how fast them hands move." Malcolm's brow lifted, but Melissa just nodded. "Sure." Tank didn't argue, but the way he looked at her had changed. He led her toward Bay 5, where a dusty black Dodge Charger sat raised on the lift, wheels off, pads half exposed. Client wanted ceramic pads. "You ever done brakes?" Tank asked, one brow arched like a challenge. Melissa squatted beside the rotor, gloves pulled tight now, hoodie sleeves bunched up. "A few dozen times." Tank crossed his arms. "Let's pretend I don't believe you." She didn't respond with words, just grabbed the caliper bolts and started loosening them. Her movements weren't rushed, but precise, measured in that way you only get when you've done the same task enough to feel it in your muscles. Jayden hovered nearby, silent, eyes wide. He'd seen a lot of kids come through that garage, pretending they were hotshots after watching YouTube tutorials. Melissa wasn't that. She wasn't looking to impress anyone. She was just working. Tank leaned against the tool chest, watching, testing, waiting for her to screw up. She didn't. The pads came off. New ones went in. She greased the caliper pins, checked the wear line, torqued the bolts like she'd learned from someone who cared more about safety than speed. Tank whistled under his breath. Not loud, just enough for Jayden to catch it. "Clock her," Tank muttered. Jayden tapped the timer on his phone. 9 minutes later, both sides were done. Melissa stood up, stretched her back, and looked at Tank. "Front's done. Rear pad's still good. One side's got a warped rotor, though. Feel it in the pedal if they don't replace it soon. Tank just stared. Jaden leaned over and showed him the timer. Tank scratched his beard. You ever considered working full-time? Before Melissa could answer, Vince barked from the other side of the garage. You hiring now, Tank? Tank raised his voice. You said, see how fast them hands move? I saw. Vince didn't respond. Malcolm chuckled under his breath and shook his head. Should have let her touch a wrench sooner. Melissa peeled off her gloves and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. She wasn't smiling, but her shoulders weren't so tight anymore. She'd walked in here a question mark. Now she was starting to look like an answer. Jaden finally spoke. Where'd you learn all this? She glanced at him. My dad. Malcolm? He asked, eyes wide. She nodded. Jaden looked stunned. He teach you? All that? She looked down for a second, then nodded again. And a lot I figured out on my own. Trial and error. Tank walked over, handed her a bottle of water, and looked her in the eye. You know torque specs for that Ferrari off the top of your head? Melissa opened the bottle, took a sip, and said, Depends. You talking about the crank bolts or the intake manifold? Tank blinked, then let out a short laugh. Damn! Vince called out again, this time louder. Jaden, back on the Civic. Tank, we've got that Yukon coming in for a timing chain. Tank nodded. Right. Melissa turned to follow her dad, but Vince called to her. You, stay. She stopped. He walked toward her, slow, with that same smug face he'd worn all morning. You had your fun. Now take a seat. This ain't a school tour. It's a workplace. Malcolm took a step forward. Vince. Melissa held up a hand. It's fine, Dad. No, it's not, Malcolm said, voice low. You proved yourself twice over. If she was a boy, she'd have a time card and a payroll number already. Vince shrugged. She's not. Melissa exhaled through her nose. She wasn't angry. Not in the way Vince wanted. She was thinking, calculating. Malcolm stepped beside her, protective as ever. She's got nothing to prove to you. But you sure as hell got something to prove to her now. That was when Eleanor Banks walked through the door. The owner of the Ferrari. She was in her 60s, elegant but not delicate, the kind of woman who looked like she could buy your house and fix your plumbing in the same afternoon. She strode straight toward the counter. I heard my car start, she said. What was the issue? Vince started to speak, but Melissa beat him to it. Crankshaft position sensor, intermittent short. It wasn't throwing codes yet, but the voltmeter caught it. Eleanor looked from Melissa to Vince. She diagnosed it, she asked. Vince hesitated, then nodded. She did. Eleanor smiled, slow and impressed. Then she's the only one I want touching my car from now on. Melissa didn't flinch, but Vince did. Malcolm couldn't hide his grin. And Jaden, standing near the lift, muttered, Holy crap. Hank just said, guess luck strikes twice. Melissa finally smiled, just a little. It wasn't the sound of the engine that changed the garage that day. It was the silence that followed after she spoke. And everyone finally listened. Melissa stood beside her father's rust-colored truck, packing away her gloves and the voltmeter into the small black duffel she always carried. The sun was starting to slide behind the neighboring buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The high-pitched whine of an orbital sander echoed from inside the shop, but her mind was elsewhere. Her body was moving on muscle memory, but her thoughts were with that Ferrari, with Eleanor Banks' approving nod, with Vince glare burning into the back of her head. Malcolm leaned against the driver's side door, arms crossed, watching her in silence. He didn't speak until she zipped the bag closed. You did good, he said. Melissa didn't look up. Not good enough for him. It's not about good enough, Malcolm said. It's about who's allowed to be right in his world. And today, you were. She gave a short nod, still not speaking. Malcolm continued, Eleanor didn't say that to be nice. She meant it. You won her respect. You earned it. Melissa finally looked up, her eyes a little darker than usual. And what now? I just keep coming in and fixing problems no one else can, and he still calls me a fluke. No, Malcolm said. You keep showing up because you're not here for him. You're here for the work. She nodded again, slower this time, but her face was set. Not in anger, but in something quieter, heavier, a quiet rage that didn't burn. It smoldered. The next morning she came in earlier than usual. The shop was barely open, but Tank was already grinding down a bolt head with goggles on and sparks flying. Jaden was at the workbench reviewing a parts sheet. Melissa dropped her bag near Bay 4 and headed straight for the whiteboard, where job assignments were listed. Her name wasn't on it. She scanned every line twice. Nothing. Then, scribbled in black Sharpie under missed to cleanup, was one word. Melissa. She stared at it. Didn't blink. Jaden walked up beside her. That ain't right. I know, she said. You want me to say something to Tank? She shook her head. It wasn't him. That's Vince's handwriting. Jaden winced. You sure? Positive. Tank removed his goggles and came over. Morning, boss. She turned toward him. Cleanup duty. Tank frowned. What? No, you're supposed to rotate tires on the Challenger in Bay 6. Not according to the board. He looked over, saw it. His jaw clenched. But I didn't write that. Sent? I know, she said again. Stay where you are, Tank muttered, already walking off toward Vince's office. Jaden looked at her. Want me to help with the tires? I'll manage, she said, heading back toward Bay 6. She pulled the impact wrench from the rack and started unfastening the lugs on the driver's side rear wheel. Her arms worked methodically, but the energy behind each motion had changed. Less cautious now, more precise, controlled, but with weight behind it. Tank came back 10 minutes later, jaw tight. Said he didn't want liability issues, Tank grunted. Said he wasn't authorizing you to do anything beyond non-mechanical work. Melissa paused mid-measure. He told Eleanor I fixed the Ferrari. Yeah, Tank muttered. And when she left, he changed the locks on the Praise. Jaden looked between them. So, what, she's just supposed to mop floors? No, Tank said. She's gonna finish this tire job, and then she's gonna help me install the intake manifold on that GT. Melissa arched an eyebrow. Won't that be a liability? Tank smirked. Good thing I'm the one doing it and you're just standing close enough to learn something. She smiled. Just barely. But that smile faded when Vince appeared in the doorway an hour later, clipboard in hand, mouth already open. I said she's not supposed to be on. Tank cut him off without looking up. She's assisting me. That a problem? Vince stepped closer. Yeah, it is. Melissa stepped back, wiping her hands on a rag, breathing steady. Vince turned to her. You want to learn? Fine. Go enroll in trade school, but this is a real garage with real work and real risk. You don't belong here unless you're certified and insured. Malcolm had stepped in by now, wiping his hands on a towel as he approached from the adjacent bay. She's here with me, he said. Then you're the one risking a lawsuit, Vince barked. I'm not getting my ass sued 'cause some kid thinks watching YouTube makes her a mechanic. I taught her, Malcolm said quietly. Vince scoffed. You haven't touched a wrench in years. And she's been touching them ever since. Jaden glanced nervously between them. Tank stood his ground, eyes locked on Vince. She diagnosed a problem none of us could, Tank said. Twice. That don't mean she's safe, Vince spat. And it sure as hell don't mean she's hired. Melissa spoke then, voice calm. I didn't ask to be hired. Vince turned on her. Then what are you here for? To learn, she said, meeting his eyes. And maybe to remind you what this place could be if you weren't so busy guarding the door. Vince didn't respond. He stared at her for a beat longer, then threw his clipboard on the bench and stormed into the office. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jayden whispered, "He's gonna blow a gasket." Tank chuckled low in his throat. Too bad Melissa just fixed the last one. Later that afternoon, a woman in heels and red lipstick walked into the shop with a little boy in tow. Eleanor Banks, again. This time, her grandson in hand. "Melissa Bosley here?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Melissa stepped out from under the GTO's hood, wiping grease from her cheek. "I told my grandson about you," Eleanor said, kneeling beside the wide-eyed boy. "He's obsessed with cars. Asked me if girls could fix Ferraris too." Melissa crouched down, met his eyes. "They can," she said, handing him the same voltmeter she'd used just yesterday. "And one day, you can too." Jayden smiled. Tank watched from the corner, arms crossed, nodding once. Vince didn't come out. Not this time. 3 days later, the shop felt different. Not quieter, garages were never quiet, but more alert. Tense in the way people get when they're waiting for something they don't know is coming. Jayden kept stealing glances toward Vince's office. Tank had stopped using the radio. And Melissa? She was under the hood of a '69 GTO, hands black with grease, humming faintly to herself. Vince hadn't said much since the argument, but Melissa kept showing up. Not to prove anything anymore, just to be where she belonged. It wasn't about fighting him. It wasn't about changing his mind. It was about refusing to leave just because she made him uncomfortable. Malcolm came by less now, not because he didn't care, but because he knew she didn't need someone watching her back every minute. She was learning to watch her own. Jayden walked over, a clipboard in his hand. "You still need help with that manifold bolt?" Melissa nodded, threadings cross-eyed. "You can try if you want." He took the wrench, knelt beside her, and smiled. "You know, when you first walked in, I didn't think you were going to last one day." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Gee, thanks." "No, I mean it," he said. "Not 'cause you weren't good. Just this place. It chews people up." She nodded slowly. "Yeah. But I guess I'd been chewed up worse." Jayden tightened the bolt and handed her back the wrench. "Well, you didn't just last. You changed the whole vibe." Melissa smirked. "Not sure Vince would agree." Jayden lowered his voice. "Maybe not. But even he can't argue with what's happening this afternoon." She frowned. "What's happening?" Before he could answer, the bell above the garage door chimed. Vince stepped out of his office in the same second, his expression tight. A flatbed truck was backing into the lot, with something covered in a massive gray tarp on its bed. 2 suited men stepped down from the cab and walked into the garage. The older one extended his hand toward Vince. "Mr. Harlow, I am Arthur Kessler. We spoke on the phone." Vince nodded stiffly. "Right. The bank's foundation." Melissa stepped out from behind the GTO, brushing her hands clean, already sensing something was off. Scrim. Arthur continued. "Eleanor Banks wanted us to personally deliver the vehicle she promised. She said, and I quote, 'Make sure Melissa gets to turn the key first.'" Melissa blinked. "What?" Arthur turned to her, smiling warmly. "You earned some serious admiration. Eleanor's restoring her late husband's car collection, but she's only entrusting this one to someone she respects." The tarp came off with a heavy flump. Beneath it sat a jet-black 1962 Jaguar E-Type, flawless down to the wire wheels, gleaming like it had just rolled off the line in Coventry. The crowd in the garage, small but growing, fell completely silent. Jaden actually whispered, "No way." Melissa walked toward it slowly, eyes wide. She reached out, but stopped her hand just above the hood. Arthur said gently, "You can touch it. She's yours to work on." Vince finally spoke. "Wait, you're leaving that here?" Arthur looked at him. "Yes, in your garage, because Melissa works here." "I didn't say." "You didn't have to," Tank interrupted, stepping between them. "We've seen what she can do. Every mechanic in this place knows it. She belongs here, Vince." Jaden chimed in, nodding. "More than half the guys you've hired this year." Vince looked like he wanted to fight it, wanted to push back, but something in his face cracked when he looked at Melissa. She wasn't angry, wasn't smug. She just stood there, hand hovering over the jag, waiting, and somehow that made it worse. Because it meant she hadn't come to take anything. She just kept earning what was already hers. Vince sighed, long, quiet, then said, "You break it, you fix it." Tane grunted. "That's kind of the point." Melissa finally touched the car, ran her fingers across the hood like it was silk. Then she walked to the driver's side, opened the door and slid in. The seat fit like it was made for her. Arthur handed her the key with a wink. "Make it purr." She turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, deep and smooth like a jazz note stretched across asphalt. Heads turned. Someone clapped, she couldn't see who. It didn't matter. Melissa sat back, let her hands rest on the wheel and smiled. Later that afternoon, when things quieted again, Vince walked over. No clipboard, no attitude. Just a man who'd run out of excuses. "She's yours to manage," he said, nodding at the jag. Melissa looked up from under the lift. "You sure?" "No," Vince admitted, "but I'm learning." She nodded once. That was enough. As the sun dipped behind the shop and the scent of oil and heat filled the air, Melissa walked the floor of the garage, not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. Jaden followed her to the back with new parts for the next job. Tank was sketching out engine diagrams for her to study, and Vince, from inside his office, didn't say a word. He didn't need to anymore. She wasn't the mechanic's daughter now. She was the mechanic. And the engine she'd fixed wasn't the only thing that had been rebuilt. So had their view of what a mechanic looked like. So had the rules. And this time, she'd written them.